The first hint of dawn was a pale gray wash against the eastern peaks, but it did little to cut the chill that clung to the hollows of Jacob's land. He rode slow, the familiar creak of his saddle a lonely rhythm in the pre-dawn quiet. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust, navigated the rocky descent towards the creek with sure-footed ease. It was a morning like any other, a ritual of checking the water levels in the northern fence line before the real work of the day began. Then Dust stopped. Not a spook, not a skittish dance, but a dead halt. His ears swiveled, pointing like twin arrows towards the rushing water of the creek. Jacob's hand went instinctively to the Winchester rifle holstered beside his saddle. He scanned the cottonwoods and the dense thicket of willows lining the bank. A coyote perhaps, or a cougar, though they rarely ventured this close to the ranch house. He nudged the buckskin forward, but the horse resisted, letting out a low, uneasy snort. Jacob dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. The air smelled of wet stone and sage, but there was another scent, something metallic and wrong. He moved with a practiced silence, his eyes tracing the line of the creek where the current ran swift and deep after the spring melt. And then he saw it. It wasn't a log or a tangle of river debris snagged on the rocks. It was a splash of color against the muted greens and browns of the riverbank, a swatch of calico dress, torn and dark with water. It was attached to a form, half in and half out of the churning water, snagged on a fallen branch that jutted out from the bank like a skeletal arm. A woman. For a moment, his heart seized in his chest. He'd seen death before in many forms, but finding it here, in the lifeblood of his own land, felt like a violation. He scrambled down the embankment, his boots slipping on the slick, mossy rocks. The water was brutally cold as it surged over his ankles, stealing the breath from his lungs. He reached her side, his mind a torrent of grim possibilities. She was lying face down, her dark hair fanned out in the current like a silken shroud. He grabbed her shoulder, intending to pull her from the water's grasp, and the flesh beneath the sodden fabric was cold, terribly cold. But as he turned her, a small, choked gasp escaped her lips. She was alive. He worked with a desperate urgency, his hands fumbling with the branch that had trapped her. It was wedged tight against her side, pinning the fabric of her dress. He put his shoulder into it, grunting with effort, until with a sharp crack the wood splintered. He gathered her into his arms, surprised by how little she weighed. She felt as fragile as a bird, a bundle of wet cloth and chilled bones. He carried her to the bank, laying her gently on the grass. Her face was pale as milk, etched with exhaustion and fear. A long, ugly gash ran from her temple down her cheek, oozing a slow trickle of blood that the creek had not yet managed to wash away. Her lips were blue, and she shivered uncontrollably, a tremor that seemed to rack her entire body. He stripped off his own heavy canvas jacket and wrapped it around her, trying to shield her from the biting wind. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and wide with a terror that seemed to go beyond her immediate plight. They were the eyes of a hunted animal. "You're safe," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You're on the Blackwater Ranch. You're safe now." Her gaze darted past him, towards the open country, as if expecting pursuers to crest the ridge at any moment. She tried to speak, but her voice was a raw, broken whisper. "No, please." "Easy now," he soothed, his hand hovering uncertainly over her shoulder. "No one's chasing you here. You need to get warm. You need a doctor." He looked around. The ranch house was a good 2-mile ride, and in her condition the journey on horseback would be agony. But leaving her here to fetch the wagon was unthinkable. He had no choice. With a grunt, he scooped her up again, cradling her against his chest. She was barely conscious, her head lolling against his shoulder. He carried her to his horse, a new and unfamiliar weight in his arms. Dust, sensing the urgency, stood stock still as Jacob carefully maneuvered himself into the saddle, settling the woman in front of him. He wrapped the reins around his hand and urged the horse into a gentle walk, his body curved protectively around his fragile cargo. Every step of the horse seemed to send a fresh wave of shivers through her. He could feel the desperate, shallow rhythm of her breathing against his chest. He had brought stray calves and injured lambs back to the ranch in much this way, but the feeling of this woman in his arms, her life hanging by such a slender thread, filled him with a profound and unsettling sense of responsibility. As the sun finally broke over the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Jacob rode towards the shelter of his home, the strange cold woman from his creek leaving a trail of questions that disturbed the quiet solitude of his life far more than the scent of blood on the morning air. The ranch house was a fortress of solitude, built of sturdy timber and river stone, a testament to Jacob's self-reliant nature. He carried the woman through the door and directly to the hearth, where the embers of last night's fire still glowed. He laid her on the thick bearskin rug, her slight form seeming to shrink against the vastness of the room. For a moment he was at a loss. It had been years since anyone but him had been inside these walls, let alone a woman in such dire need. His hands, calloused and accustomed to the rough work of branding irons and leather reins, felt clumsy and ill-suited for this delicate task. First, the wet clothes. He knew he had to get them off her or the chill would surely kill her. He worked methodically, his movements gentle but efficient. He unfastened the tiny buttons of her calico dress, his fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar task. The dress was torn in several places, and underneath she wore a simple thin chemise, equally soaked and clinging to her skin. He averted his eyes as best he could, a flush of heat rising to his face, feeling like an intruder. He wrapped her in a thick wool blanket from his own bed, cocooning her in its warmth. Her shivering began to subside, replaced by a deep, unnerving stillness. The gash on her face was worse than he'd thought, angry and inflamed. He fetched the small wooden box where he kept his medical supplies, salve, clean bandages, and a bottle of whiskey for disinfection. He knelt beside her and gently cleaned the wound. She flinched, a low moan escaping her lips, but she didn't wake. Her face, even pale and bruised, had a delicate beauty to it. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and a soft, full mouth. There was a story in that face, a story of hardship that went far beyond her ordeal in the creek. As he worked, his mind raced. Who was she? How had she ended up in his creek, miles from the nearest town or settlement? Her clothes were simple but well made, not the rags of a vagrant. And her hands, though scraped and bruised, were soft, not hardened by manual labor. He finished bandaging her head and stood up, looking down at the woman who had so violently crashed into his life. He needed to ride to town, to fetch Doc Adams, but he couldn't leave her alone. What if she woke up, terrified and disoriented? He decided to wait. He built up the fire, the flames leaping high and casting a warm, flickering light across the room. He put a pot of coffee on to boil and settled into the chair opposite her, his rifle leaning against the armrest. The house, usually a place of profound silence, was now filled with the soft sound of her breathing. It was a sound that both comforted and unsettled him. Hours passed. The sun climbed high in the sky and the morning chores went undone. The cattle would have to wait. Jacob sat and watched her, a sentinel in his own home. He drank his coffee, his eyes constantly returning to her face. There was something about her, a familiarity that he couldn't quite place. It tugged at the edge of his memory, a persistent, frustrating whisper. Around noon, her eyelids fluttered again. This time, they opened fully. Her dark eyes, clear now but filled with a deep, wary caution, scanned the room before settling on him. Fear flared in them, stark and raw. She tried to push herself up, the blanket falling away from her shoulders. "Easy," he said, holding up a hand. "You're safe here. I found you in the creek." She stared at him, her gaze intense, searching. "Where? Where am I?" "My ranch. It's a few miles north of Redemption." The name of the town seemed to strike her. A new wave of anxiety washed over her features. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. I have to go." "You're in no condition to go anywhere," he said firmly. "You almost died of cold. You have a nasty cut on your head. You need to rest." "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll be looking for me." "Who will?" She shook her head, her lips pressed into a tight line. The fear in her eyes was mingled with a fierce, protective secrecy. She wasn't going to tell him. Not yet. He sighed, running a hand through his own unkempt hair. "Look, miss, I don't know your name or your business, but I'm not in the habit of turning injured folks out into the wild. You can stay here until you're here. I keep to myself." Her expression softened slightly, though the suspicion remained. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why would you help me?" It was a fair question. Jacob was not known for his hospitality. He had bought this land and built this house to be away from people, to escape a past he preferred to keep buried. But looking at her, so vulnerable and yet so determined, he knew he couldn't have done anything else. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. He stood up and ladled some broth from a pot he'd set to simmer on the hearth. He handed the bowl to her. "Eat this. It will help." She took it, her hands still shaking. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving his face, as if trying to decipher the truth of his words, the measure of his character. And in the long, quiet moments that followed, a fragile truce settled between them, as tentative and uncertain as the woman herself. Later that afternoon, Jacob rode into Redemption. He needed supplies and he needed to check the mail. He felt a strange reluctance to leave the woman alone, but he knew he couldn't put it off any longer. He left her resting by the fire, a fresh log crackling and spitting, her promise to not move until he returned hanging in the air between them. The town of Redemption was a dusty collection of clapboard buildings baking under the afternoon sun. He tied dust to the hitching post outside the general store, his mind still on his unexpected house guest. He bought flour, coffee, and a few tins of peaches, a luxury he rarely afforded himself. He also bought a bolt of simple dark blue cotton fabric and a sewing kit, thinking of the woman's ruined dress. His last stop was the sheriff's office. It also served as the town's post office. Sheriff Miller was a portly man with a handlebar mustache and a lazy disposition. He sat with his feet propped up on his desk, reading a day-old newspaper. "Jacob?" he grunted, not bothering to move. "Don't see you in town much." "Just getting supplies, Sheriff," Jacob said, his voice even. "Anything for me?" Miller gestured to a small stack of letters on the corner of his desk. "Just the usual, ads and such." Jacob sorted through the mail, his name written in stark black ink. And then his eyes fell on the wall behind the sheriff's desk. It was the wall where they posted bounties and wanted notices. He rarely paid them any mind. The affairs of other men were not his concern, but today a new poster caught his eye. It was fresh, the paper crisp and white. A crudely drawn but unmistakable portrait of a woman with dark, haunted eyes and a delicate face. His blood ran cold. He stepped closer, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat in his chest. The drawing was a perfect likeness of the woman currently sleeping in his house, wrapped in his blanket, her head resting on his pillow. Beneath the drawing, in bold black letters, were the words, "Wanted, for robbery and murder, Eliza Galloway, $10,000 reward." The ride back to the ranch was a blur of dust and dread. The wanted poster felt like a brand on his mind, its stark words searing into his thoughts. $10,000. It was a staggering sum, enough to buy a man a new life, to erase any past mistakes. It was more money than Jacob had ever seen, and the woman he had just rescued, the woman he had promised was safe, was worth that much. Dead or alive, he found her exactly where he'd left her, asleep by the fire. The blue fabric and sewing kit he'd bought now seemed like a foolish, naive gesture. He dropped the supplies on the large wooden table with a thud that made her start, her eyes flying open in alarm. "You're back," she said, her voice small. He didn't answer. He walked to the mantelpiece, his back to her, and gripped the rough-hewn wood until his knuckles turned white. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with his unspoken accusation. "What is it?" she asked, sensing the change in him. "What's wrong?" He turned slowly, his face a mask of stone. "I went to town." Her body tensed, the fragile peace of the morning shattering. You told someone?" "No," he said, his voice flat. "I didn't have to. Your face is plastered all over the sheriff's wall." He took a breath, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Wanted, for robbery and murder, Eliza Galloway." Her name, spoken aloud, seemed to hang in the air between them, an indictment. All the color drained from her face, leaving it as pale as it had been when he pulled her from the creek. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a profound, heart-wrenching despair. She didn't deny it. She simply lowered her head, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "So it's true," he said, more to himself than to her. She looked up, and for the first time he saw a spark of defiance in her gaze. "It's not what you think, isn't it?" He shot back, his voice rising with a raw, bitter anger, an anger born of betrayal. "The poster said you were involved in a stagecoach robbery near Blackstone. A guard was killed. They say you shot him." "I didn't kill anyone," she cried, her voice cracking. "I've never even held a gun in my life." "Then why are you running? Why did I find you half drowned in my creek miles from anywhere?" Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "Because they'll hang me. They won't listen." "They never listen to a woman like me." Jacob stared at her, his mind at war with itself. The evidence was damning. A wanted poster, a dead guard, a woman on the run. His every instinct for self-preservation, honed by years of solitude and a deep-seated mistrust of others, screamed at him to tie her up and ride straight back to redemption. $10,000 would solve all his problems. It would secure the ranch for good, buy the new bull he needed, and fix the barn roof that threatened to collapse with every winter storm. But then he looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, the raw desperation. He remembered the feel of her, so fragile and cold in his arms, and he remembered the soft, uncalloused skin of her hands. These were not the hands of a killer. "Tell me," he said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "Tell me what happened. The truth." She hesitated, her gaze darting towards the door as if measuring her chances of escape. But she was weak, and he stood between her and the only exit. She took a shuddering breath and began to speak, her voice low and halting at first, then gaining strength as the story poured out of her. "My name is Eliza," she began. "Eliza Galloway. My husband, his name was Thomas." She spoke the name with a bitterness that surprised Jacob. "He was a gambler, a charmer when he wanted to be, but a man with a darkness in him. We were always moving, always in debt, always one step ahead of trouble. I thought I could save him from himself." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "A few days ago, he fell in with a man named Silas Black, a hard man with cruel eyes. They planned the stagecoach robbery. Thomas told me it was just to get enough money to start fresh, to go to California. He swore no one would get hurt. He begged me to come with them, to be their lookout. He said he needed me." "And you believed him?" Jacob stated, the judgment clear in his tone. "I was a fool," she whispered, shamefaced. "I know that now. I stood by the road just as they told me. When the stagecoach came, Silas and Thomas rode out, their faces covered. It all happened so fast. There was shouting, a gunshot. I saw the guard fall. And then Thomas was running towards me, stuffing a money bag into my hands. He told me to run, to meet him at an old cabin north of here." "But he never showed up," Jacob guessed. She shook her head, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "No, I waited for 2 days. He never came. I think he and Silas set me up. They needed someone to take the fall. The driver saw my face before I could pull my scarf up. They knew I would be the one identified. Thomas, he used me. The story was plausible enough to be the truth, or plausible enough to be a well-rehearsed lie." Jacob's mind reeled. If she was telling the truth, she was a victim, betrayed by the man who should have protected her. If she was lying, she was a cold-blooded murderer and a skilled manipulator. He paced the length of the room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He stopped at the window and stared out at his land, the land he had bled for, fought for. $10,000 could protect it. But turning her in, it felt wrong. It felt like a betrayal of the promise he had made her that morning, a promise that she was safe. "They'll be hunting you," he said, turning back to face her. "Black, your husband, and the law. A bounty that big will bring every bounty hunter from here to the territories." "No," she said quietly. "I didn't know where else to go. I just ran." He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the gash on her forehead, the bruises on her arms from being tossed about in the creek, the raw hope and terror warring in her eyes. And in that moment he made a choice. It was a choice that went against all logic, against every instinct for self-preservation he possessed. It was a choice born from a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Compassion. "All right," he said, the word feeling momentous. A turning point. "All right, Eliza." He walked over to the new bolt of fabric on the table. He picked it up along with the sewing kit and placed them in her lap. "You'll need a new dress," he said, his voice gruff. "And we need to burn the old one. No one comes up to this ranch. No one. For now, you'll be safe here." The decision settled in the room, heavy and irrevocable. Eliza stared at the bolt of blue cotton in her lap as if it were a lifeline. The rough, practical fabric was a promise, a tangible piece of hope in a world that had offered her none. "Why?" she asked again, her voice thick with emotion. "That money? It could change your life." Jacob looked away, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. "Maybe," he said, his voice low, "or maybe it would just be another chain. I've had enough of those." He didn't elaborate, and Eliza knew not to press. His past was a closed door. just as hers had been only moments before. An uneasy alliance formed between them in the days that followed. It was an existence dictated by caution. During the day, Eliza stayed inside the small, sturdy house, away from the windows. The world shrank to the four walls of Jacob's home, a sanctuary that felt both safe and confining. At night, Jacob would secure the doors and windows, his rifle always within arm's reach. The first order of business was to erase the woman who had been dragged from the creek. While Jacob was out on the range undertaking the most necessary of his chores, Eliza, with shaking hands, fed the torn and muddied remnants of her calico dress into the fire. She watched the flames consume the fabric, the last link to her old life, to the foolish girl who had trusted the wrong man. It felt like a funeral. Her hands, though unused to such work, were nimble. Using the sewing kit Jacob had bought, she began to fashion a new dress from the blue cotton. The simple act of creating something, of mending her own broken world, one stitch at a time, was therapeutic. The steady rhythm of the needle was a counterpoint to the frantic beating of her heart whenever she heard a distant sound. A coyote's howl, the wind whistling through the eaves, and mistook it for the hoofbeats of approaching riders. Jacob was a quiet, almost spectral presence. He would leave before dawn and return after dusk, his face etched with the weariness of hard labor and sleepless nights. He spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. He left food for her on the table, fresh water in the basin. One day he brought her a handful of wildflowers, leaving them in a tin cup on the windowsill, a splash of vibrant color in the Spartan room. The house slowly began to change. Eliza, unable to bear the idleness, started to impose a quiet order on the bachelor's domain. She swept the floors, washed the few dishes, and tidied the clutter. She found she had a knack for cooking, turning the simple provisions of flour, beans, and salted meat into savory stews that were waiting for Jacob when he returned, exhausted from his work. Slowly, hesitantly, they began to talk. The conversations were stilted at first, circling the edges of their lives like wary wolves. She told him about her childhood in a small town in Ohio, her love of books, her dreams of a quiet life that had been so cruelly derailed. He in turn offered small, guarded pieces of himself. He spoke of his parents, who had died of fever when he was young, and his struggle to build this ranch from nothing. He spoke of the land with a deep, abiding love, the only thing, it seemed, that had never betrayed him. One evening, as she was mending a tear in his work shirt, he sat across from her, cleaning his rifle. The familiar scent of gun oil filled the air. "You said you've never held a gun," he stated. Not as a question, but as a fact he was re-examining. "I haven't," she confirmed, not looking up from her sewing. "You'll need to learn." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. "No, I couldn't." "You have to," he insisted, his voice firm but not unkind. "I can't be here every minute of the day. If someone comes to that door, you can't hesitate. You need to be able to protect yourself." The thought sent a tremor of fear through her. A gun was a symbol of the violence that had shattered her life. It was the weapon that had killed a man, the reason she was a fugitive. But looking at the grim determination in Jacob's face, she knew he was right. Her helplessness was a liability, a danger to them both. The next day, he took her to a secluded clearing behind the barn. He placed a small, lightweight revolver in her hand. It felt cold and alien, unnaturally heavy. Her hand trembled so violently she could barely hold it. "Feel the weight of it," he said, his voice calm and steady behind her. He stood close, his presence a solid wall at her back. "Respect what it can do." He showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. Her first few shots were wild, hitting the dirt far from the tin cans he had set up on a fence post. She was frustrated, ready to give up, the loud report of the gun jarring her nerves. "Again," he said patiently. He adjusted her stance, his large calloused hands gently guiding her arms. She could feel the warmth of his body, smell the scent of leather and dust that clung to him. His proximity was both unnerving and deeply reassuring. "Breathe out as you squeeze," he instructed, his voice low in her ear. "Don't pull, just let it happen." She took a deep breath, focused on the distant can, and squeezed. The gun bucked in her hand, but this time she was ready. The can flew off the fence post with a satisfying ping. A small shaky smile touched her lips. "Again," he said, a hint of approval in his voice. She fired again and another can fell. She was still afraid of the weapon, but a small measure of control, of power, began to seed itself within her. She was no longer just the helpless victim. She was a woman who could fight back. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden rays across the clearing, they walked back to the house in a comfortable silence. The shared lesson had forged a new, stronger link in the chain of their alliance. But as they neared the barn, Jacob suddenly stopped. He held up a hand, signaling for silence. His eyes were fixed on the ground. Eliza followed his gaze. There, in the soft earth, were fresh tracks, hoof prints, and they were not from Jacob's horse. Someone had been there, and they had been watching the house. A cold dread washed over Eliza, erasing the small victory of the afternoon. The hoof prints were a stark physical manifestation of the threat that had, until now, been a nameless fear. Jacob knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of one of the impressions in the dirt. 2 riders, he said, his voice a low growl. They were careful, kept to the rocks mostly, but got sloppy here. He looked up, his eyes scanning the surrounding ridges now bathed in the deep orange of the setting sun. Embers were watching us. For how long, there's no telling. The sanctuary of the ranch was broken. The walls of the house no longer felt like a fortress, but a trap. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden menace. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered threat. "The bounty hunters?" Eliza whispered, her hand instinctively going to her throat. "Or your husband," Jacob said, his face grim. "Either way, they know you're here. Or, at least, they suspect." That night, there was no pretense of normalcy. They ate their meal in a tense silence, the food tasteless in their mouths. Jacob didn't sit. He paced, moving from the window to the door, his rifle held loosely in his hand. The revolver he had given Eliza lay on the table beside her plate, a cold and heavy reminder of the day's lesson. "They won't come at night," Jacob said, trying to reassure her, or perhaps himself. "Too risky. They don't know the land. They'll wait for daylight." But sleep was impossible. Eliza lay on the small cot Jacob had set up for her, her eyes wide open in the darkness, listening. She listened to the creak of the floorboards as Jacob kept his vigil in the main room. She listened to the mournful howl of a distant wolf. She listened for the sound that would signal the end of her fragile peace, the crunch of boots on gravel, the whinny of a strange horse. Just before dawn, Jacob came to her side. "They're coming," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. 2 riders, from the east. He had seen them from the hayloft window, 2 dark figures moving slowly against the pale dawn sky. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. The flight was over. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jacob's expression was resolute. The time for indecision was long past. The choice he had made days ago, in the heat of anger and confusion, had now solidified into a cold, hard certainty. He was in this, with her. "There's a root cellar," he said, pulling back the bearskin rug to reveal a heavy trap door set into the floor. "The entrance is hidden. You'll be safe there. Take the revolver. If anyone but me opens that door, you use it." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I won't hide while you face them alone." The woman who had wept in fear was gone, replaced by someone steeled by desperation. "This is not a discussion, Eliza," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Telling you, not me. If they find me alone, I'm just a rancher on his land. I can talk my way out of it. If they find you here, they'll kill us both and burn the house down for good measure. You will do as I say." He helped her down into the small, dark space. It smelled of earth and damp stone. He handed her the revolver, his hand closing over hers for a brief moment. His touch was firm, grounding. "Do not make a sound," he whispered, "no matter what you hear." He closed the door, and the world plunged into absolute darkness. The heavy rug muffled the sounds from above, leaving her alone with the frantic beating of her own heart. Above, Jacob prepared for the confrontation. He moved the table to cover the trap door, placed a chair in its usual spot. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands steady. He sat at the table, his rifle leaning against the wall next to him, and waited. The hoofbeats grew louder, stopping just outside the house. Then came the heavy thud of boots on the porch. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the room. Jacob took a slow sip of his coffee before calling out, "The door's unlocked." 2 men stepped inside, their presence immediately filling the small space. The first was tall and wiry, with a cruel, thin-lipped smile and eyes that darted around the room, taking in every detail. The second was a brute of a man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol strapped to his hip. "That's far enough," Jacob said, his voice calm but with an underlying edge of steel. The wiry man smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Morning, rancher. Name's Black, Silas Black." He jerked a thumb towards his companion. "This here's my associate." Eliza, listening from the darkness below, felt her blood run cold. It was him, the man from her nightmares, Silas Black. And if he was here, where was Thomas? "What do you want?" Jacob asked, his gaze unwavering. "We're looking for someone," Silas said, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Jacob. "A woman, dark hair, pretty face. Answers to the name Eliza Galloway. You might know her. Her face is on a wanted poster. $10,000 worth of pretty." "Never heard of her," Jacob said flatly. "I keep to myself out here." Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Is that so? Funny thing is, we tracked her this far. The trail went cold right around this ranch. Led us straight to your creek, as a matter of fact." He took a step forward, his hand moving casually towards his own gun. "We also found these." He reached into his pocket and tossed something onto the table. It was a small mother-of-pearl button glinting in the morning light. Eliza recognized it immediately. It was from the cuff of her calico dress. She must have lost it in the creek. "A woman's button," Silas said softly. "Found not 20 yards from your front door. Now you can tell me you haven't seen her, and maybe I'll believe you. Or maybe my friend and I will have to tear this place apart to find out for ourselves." Jacob didn't move a muscle. He looked from the button to Silas Black's smug face. The lie had run its course. Now there was only the promise he had made, to himself and to the woman hiding beneath his feet. "I think," Jacob said slowly, his hand dropping from his coffee cup to rest on his thigh, inches from the rifle propped against the wall, "that it's time for you to leave my property." Silas Black's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. They remained cold, calculating chips of obsidian. Brave words for a man who lives 2 days' ride from the nearest law. "The law doesn't seem to be your primary concern," Jacob retorted, his voice level. "Considering who you are." Silas's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "And who might that be?" "You're Eliza's accomplice," Jacob stated, "the one who ran just like her husband. Only, you're not here for the bounty. You're here to tie up a loose end. You're here to silence the only witness who can put you at the scene of that robbery." Below the floorboards, Eliza's heart pounded. Jacob understood. He hadn't just believed her, he had pieced together the truth of the situation with terrifying accuracy. Silas let out a short, sharp laugh. "You've got a vivid imagination, rancher. But you're right about one thing. We're not leaving without her." He nodded to his hulking companion, who began to move slowly toward the back of the room, his eyes scanning for any possible hiding place. "Told you," Jacob said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low, "to get off my land." "And I told you," Silas hissed, his hand finally closing around the handle of his pistol. "We're not—" He never finished the sentence. In a single fluid motion, Jacob kicked the table forward, sending the coffee cup flying. In the same instant, his hand closed around his Winchester. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked was deafening in the sudden silence. The big man froze, his hand hovering over his own weapon. Silas stared down the barrel of the rifle, his smug confidence evaporating like mist in the sun. "You're fast," Silas admitted, a grudging respect in his tone. "But there are 2 of us. And there's only one of me who knows where he's aiming," Jacob countered. "Now, I'm going to say it one last time. Get out." For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension was a physical thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. Eliza, in the suffocating darkness of the cellar, held her breath, the revolver clutched in her sweating palms. She could hear the muffled scrape of boots, the tense breathing, the unspoken violence hanging in the air. Silas weighed his options. He had come here expecting a simple farmer, an easy mark. He had not expected a man who moved with the deadly grace of a predator, whose eyes held no fear. He glanced at his partner, who looked uncertain, his bravado crumbling in the face of Jacob's cold resolve. Slowly, deliberately, Silas raised his hands, a gesture of mock surrender. "All right, rancher, all right, you win this round." He began to back away towards the door, his eyes never leaving Jacob's. "But this isn't over. We know she's here, and $10,000 buys a lot of patience. We can wait." He and his partner backed out of the door, their boots thudding on the porch. Jacob followed them with the rifle, standing framed in the doorway as they mounted their horses. "Don't come back," Jacob called out. his voice carrying across the yard. Silas turned his horse, a malicious grin once again spreading across his face. "Oh, we'll be back, and next time we'll bring more friends. You and your little canary can't hide forever." They spurred their horses and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Jacob stood watching until they were nothing but small specks on the horizon. Only then did he lower the rifle, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving him feeling cold and drained. He bolted the door and moved the table back into place. He pulled open the trap door. "They're gone," he said. Eliza scrambled out, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. She looked at him, at the rifle still in his hand, at the hard, determined set of his jaw. He had faced them down, for her. A man who barely knew her had risked his life to protect her. "You believe me?" she whispered. It wasn't a question. "I believe what I see," he said, leaning the rifle against the wall. "I see a man in a hurry to silence a witness, and I see a woman who is betrayed." He finally looked at her, his gaze softening. "They'll be back, Eliza." He wasn't bluffing. "What will we do?" she asked, the fear creeping back into her voice. "We can't just wait for them," he said, his mind already working. "We need to prove your innocence, and there's only one person who can do that." "Who?" "Your husband," Jacob said. "Thomas. Silas is afraid of what you might say. That means Thomas must be too. If we can find him, if we can make him talk, we can clear your name." The thought of facing Thomas again filled Eliza with a nauseating dread, but Jacob was right. Hiding was no longer an option. The fight had come to them, and now they had to take it back to the men who had ruined her life. "How?" she asked. "We don't even know where he is." "Silas gave us a clue," Jacob said. "We tracked her this far," he said. "Not I. We. He and Thomas must have been together. But Silas is here and Thomas isn't. Why split up? Unless Thomas had to be somewhere else." He started pacing again, not with anxiety but with purpose. "The robbery was near Blackstone. They had a meeting place planned, you said. An old cabin. Maybe Thomas went back there. Or maybe he's holed up somewhere, waiting for Silas to bring him the news that you're dead." A desperate plan began to form in Jacob's mind. It was risky, almost suicidal, but it was better than waiting for a war to land on their doorstep. "I'm going to find him," Jacob declared. "I'm going to Blackstone. I'll find that cabin. I'll find your husband." "You can't go alone," Eliza protested. "It's too dangerous. Silas and his men could be anywhere." "It's more dangerous for you to leave this ranch," he countered. "They'll be watching the roads. They're looking for you. They're not looking for me." He stopped in front of her, his expression serious. "You'll have to be brave, Eliza. You'll have to hold the fort here, alone. Can you do that?" She looked at the revolver, then back at his face. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But now it was mingled with something else, a flicker of strength, a sense of purpose. She was not just hiding anymore. She was part of the fight. She nodded, her resolve hardening. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I can." Leaving Eliza was one of the hardest things Jacob had ever done. The image of her standing in the doorway, small and vulnerable but with a new, fierce light in her eyes, was burned into his memory as he rode east. He left her with the revolver, plenty of ammunition, and strict instructions not to open the door for anyone. He had barricaded the windows and shown her how to watch the approaches to the ranch from the hayloft, a high vantage point that offered a clear view of the surrounding valley. The journey to Blackstone was tense. Every rider he saw in the distance made his hand stray to the Winchester in its scabbard. Every secluded canyon and rocky outcrop seemed like a potential ambush point. He was a rancher, a man of the land, but now he was moving through a world of hunters and fugitives, and the familiar landscape felt alien and hostile. He rode hard, pushing dust to the limits of his endurance, and reached the dusty, ramshackle town of Blackstone in 2 days. It was a town with an air of desperation, a temporary stop for miners and prospectors, where the whiskey was cheap and life was cheaper. The stagecoach robbery was still the main topic of conversation in the saloon, the story growing more embellished with each telling. Jacob listened quietly from a corner table, nursing a beer, gathering information. The murdered guard had a family, the stage line had added more outriders, and the bounty for Eliza Galloway had attracted a dozen fortune seekers who were now combing the hills, hungry for blood and gold. He also heard whispers about Silas Black, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and contempt. a man known for his ruthlessness and for leaving his partners high and dry. Following Eliza's vague description, Jacob began his search for the cabin. He spent a full day crisscrossing the rugged, pine-choked hills north of the town. It was a frustrating, needle-in-a-haystack search. There were dozens of abandoned trappers' lean-tos and prospectors' shacks dotting the landscape. Finally, late in the afternoon, he found it. Tucked away in a small hidden valley, almost completely swallowed by overgrown aspen trees, was a dilapidated cabin. A thin wisp of smoke curled from its mud and stick chimney. Jacob dismounted, tying dust in a dense grove of trees where he wouldn't be seen. He approached the cabin with the silence of a hunter, his rifle in his hands. The place was a ruin. The roof sagged and the single window was boarded up, but someone was inside. He circled around to the back where a section of the chinken between the logs had fallen away, creating a small peephole. He peered inside. The interior was squalid, a dirty cot, a small table, and a man sitting hunched over it staring into a bottle of whiskey. He was thin with a weak chin and restless, shifty eyes. He looked like a man who had been eaten away from the inside by failure and regret. It had to be Thomas Galloway. Jacob watched him for a long time, formulating a plan. He could burst in, hold him at gunpoint, but Thomas looked like a cornered rat, unpredictable and dangerous in his desperation. Jacob needed him alive, and he needed him to talk. He needed leverage. He crept back to his horse and retrieved his rope. He waited for darkness to fall, a deep moonless dark that blanketed the small valley. The only light came from the faint flickering glow of the candle inside the cabin. When he was sure Thomas was deep in his drunken stupor, Jacob made his move. He approached the cabin's single door, a flimsy construction of weathered planks. He took a deep breath and kicked. The door flew inward with a splintering crash. Jacob was inside before Thomas could even register what was happening. The man scrambled back, his chair tipping over, his eyes wide with drunken terror. He fumbled for a pistol lying on the table, but Jacob was too fast. He kicked the table, sending the gun clattering to the floor, and in the next moment, he had Thomas pinned against the wall, the hard muzzle of the Winchester pressed against his throat. "Don't even think about it," Jacob snarled. Who are you?" Thomas stammered, his face ashen. "Did Silas send you?" "No," Jacob said, his voice cold. "Eliza sent me." The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. His bravado, what little he had, crumbled completely. "Eliza? Is she all right?" "She's alive," Jacob said. "No thanks to you. I didn't mean for it to happen like this," Thomas whined, tears of self-pity welling in his eyes. "Silas, he's the one who shot the guard. He went crazy. I just wanted the money. I told Eliza to run, to save herself." "You told her to run right into a trap?" Jacob corrected him, pressing the rifle barrel harder against his throat. "You set her up. You and Silas. You used her as a decoy while you two made your getaway." Thomas started sobbing, a pathetic, broken sound. "Silas made me do it. He said they'd be looking for a man and a woman. He said if they caught her, it would give us time to get away clean. He promised he'd come back for me, but he never did." The pieces clicked into place. Silas had betrayed his partner, just as he'd betrayed Eliza. He planned to let Thomas wait in the cabin, a second scapegoat if needed, while he hunted down and silenced the primary witness. "So you've just been hiding here, waiting for him?" Jacob asked with disgust. "I didn't know what else to do," Thomas cried. "The bounty's on her head, not mine. I was going to go to California, start over." "Your new life is over, Thomas," Jacob said grimly. He pulled Thomas away from the wall and with swift, efficient movements, tied his hands behind his back. "You're going to make a statement. You're going to tell the sheriff in Blackstone everything. About the robbery, about Silas, and about how you framed your own wife." Thomas's eyes went wide with panic. "No, I can't. Silas will kill me." "He'll kill you anyway," Jacob said flatly. "Your only chance of surviving this is to tell the truth. Maybe the law will go easier on you if you cooperate." He dragged the whimpering, defeated man out of the cabin and hoisted him onto Dust's back, tying his feet together under the horse's belly. The journey back to Blackstone would be slow, but Jacob felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He had the key. He had the truth. As he led the horse out of the hidden valley, he looked up at the stars, thinking of Eliza alone at the ranch. He hoped she was safe. He hoped he wasn't too late. The solitude of the ranch pressed in on Eliza from all sides. In the first days after Jacob left, she was a bundle of raw nerves. She moved through the house like a ghost, starting at every creak of the floorboards, her heart leaping into her throat at the cry of a hawk. She kept the revolver with her at all times, its weight a constant, unsettling reminder of her precarious situation. She spent most of the daylight hours in the hayloft, as Jacob had instructed. From the small, dusty window, she could see the entire valley spread out before her. It was a beautiful, lonely landscape, and she felt like a prisoner in a vast open-air cell. She watched the dirt track that led to the ranch until her eyes ached, praying for the sight of Jacob's familiar form on the horizon, dreading the appearance of anyone else. But as the days wore on, a subtle change began to take place. The constant fear, sharp and paralyzing at first, began to dull into a state of hypervigilance. Her senses sharpened. She learned to distinguish the sound of the wind from the rustle of an animal in the undergrowth. She learned the patterns of the hawks that circled overhead, the habits of the deer that came to drink at the creek in the early morning. She was still afraid, but the fear no longer controlled her. It was a tool, something to be managed and used. She was no longer just waiting to be rescued. She was standing guard. She was protecting her own life and the home of the man who had given her a chance to save it. She thought of Jacob constantly. She pictured his strong, calloused hands, his quiet, steady presence. She remembered the gruff kindness in his voice, the way his eyes, so often hard and guarded, would soften when he looked at her. He had taken an immense risk for her. A stranger, he had trusted her on instinct, on a flicker of compassion that he kept buried deep beneath a rugged exterior. In the quiet hours of the night, huddled in the lonely house, she realized with a startling clarity that her feelings for him ran deeper than gratitude. She cared for him. She cared for his safety, for his happiness. The thought of something happening to him on his dangerous quest was a pain sharper than her own fear. On the 5th day of her vigil, she saw them. 3 riders, coming from the east, just as Silas had. They were moving slowly, deliberately, their forms dark against the morning sun. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she raised the small spyglass Jacob had left for her. It was Silas Black, and with him were 2 other men, hard-faced and armed to the teeth. They were not the kind of men who came for a friendly visit. She scrambled down from the hayloft, her mind racing. Jacob had told her to hide, to wait. But Silas had seen the ranch. He knew its layout. He would not be fooled again. Hiding in the cellar felt like waiting in a tomb. She had to do something different, something unexpected. She ran to the house, her boots pounding on the hard-packed earth. She bolted the door, then ran to the fireplace. With trembling hands, she began to build up the fire, piling on log after log until the hearth roared with a fierce, intense heat. She opened the flue wide, and a thick column of black smoke began to pour from the chimney. It was a desperate gamble, a signal to anyone who might be in the surrounding hills, the signal of trouble. It might bring the wrong kind of attention, but it was better than being trapped and slaughtered in silence. Then she grabbed the revolver and Jacob's rifle, a box of cartridges, and a skin of water. She slipped out the back of the house and ran, not towards the cellar, but towards the rocky ridge that overlooked the ranch from the north. It was a steep, difficult climb, and she scrambled over boulders and through thorny brush, her lungs burning. She found a defensible position, a small alcove nestled among a cluster of granite boulders. It offered a clear view of the house and the yard below while keeping her almost completely concealed. She laid out her ammunition, checked the loads in both the rifle and the revolver. Her hands were shaking, but a cold, clear purpose settled over her. She would not be a victim. She would not be a witness. She would be a fighter. Down below, Silas and his men reined in their horses, their eyes fixed on the column of smoke billowing from the chimney. "What in the hell is that?" one of the men asked. "It's a signal," Silas snarled, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "She's smarter than I thought. She's not in there." He scanned the surrounding hills, his gaze sweeping over the landscape. "Spread out, find her. She can't have gone far." The men dismounted, fanning out across the valley, their rifles at the ready. Silas himself approached the house, cautious as a wolf circling its prey. He kicked open the door, saw the roaring fire in the empty room, and let out a roar of frustration. From her perch on the ridge, Eliza watched them. She rested the heavy Winchester on a flat rock, just as Jacob had shown her. She lined up the sights, centering them on a large water barrel next to the barn. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the report echoing across the valley. Down below, the water barrel exploded, splinters of wood flying through the air. The three men froze, spinning around to stare up at the ridge. "There," one of them yelled, pointing. A bullet whined past Eliza's head, ricocheting off the rock behind her with a sharp crack. She ducked down, her heart pounding. They knew where she was. This was no longer just about survival. It was a battle, and she was holding the high ground. The ride back to the ranch with Thomas Galloway in tow was slow and fraught with tension. Jacob pushed them both relentlessly, driven by a gnawing urgency. He had the proof he needed, but it was worthless if he couldn't get it to the law, and more importantly, if he couldn't get back to Eliza. He imagined her alone, vulnerable, and spurred his horse onward. As they crested the final ridge overlooking his valley, his blood ran cold. A thick plume of black smoke was rising from the direction of his ranch house, a grim signal of disaster. "No," he breathed, his mind instantly leaping to the worst possible conclusion. Silas. He had gone back. He had burned the house. And Eliza. A guttural rage, primal and overwhelming, surged through him. He dug his heels into dust sides, the horse leaping forward into a reckless gallop down the rocky slope. Thomas, jostled and terrified on the back of the horse, cried out in protest, but Jacob didn't hear him. His world had narrowed to that column of smoke and the terrible possibilities it represented. As he got closer, the sound of sporadic gunfire reached him, a sharp, deadly counterpoint to the thundering of his horse's hooves. His initial despair gave way to a sliver of hope. A fire didn't shoot back. She was alive. She was fighting. He burst into the valley and took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The house was intact, the smoke pouring from the chimney, not the roof. Three men were spread out at the base of the northern ridge, using the barn and a small cluster of cottonwoods for cover. They were firing up at the rocks, and from those rocks an answering shot would ring out, precise and controlled. Eliza! She'd taken the high ground. She had turned his ranch into a fortress. A fierce, protective pride swelled in his chest, so powerful it almost choked him. The woman he had pulled from a creek, shivering and helpless, was now holding three armed men at bay with his rifle. He didn't hesitate. He veered dust towards the cover of the very creek where he had found her, the willows and thick brush providing a concealed approach. He dismounted, gagged the still protesting Thomas with a strip of cloth, and tied him securely to a tree. "You make a sound and I'll leave you here for the coyotes," Jacob hissed, his eyes promising a fate worse than any sheriff could deliver. He took his rifle and began to move, using the terrain with a hunter's instinct. He circled wide, coming up behind the position where the three men were pinned down by Eliza's fire. They were focused on the ridge, frustrated and angry. "Damn woman shoots like a man," one of them grumbled, reloading his rifle behind the relative safety of the barn wall. "She can't stay up there forever," Silas snarled back. "She'll run out of bullets eventually. Just keep her pinned." From his concealed position, Jacob raised his Winchester. He had a clear shot at Silas Black. He could end it right here, a single bullet, to avenge the guard, to free Eliza, to reclaim his peace. His finger tightened on the trigger, but he paused. Killing Silas in cold blood would make him no better than the man himself. It would make him a murderer. And Eliza's name would still be on that wanted poster. They needed Thomas's testimony. They needed the law. He shifted his aim. He didn't need to kill them, he just needed to change the odds. He fired, not at Silas, but at the man closest to him, the one reloading by the barn. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of the man's shoulder. He screamed and dropped his rifle, clutching the wound. Silas and the other man spun around, their faces a mask of shock and confusion. They were caught in a crossfire. "What the hell?" the third man yelled, frantically looking for the source of the new threat. "He's the rancher," Silas roared, finally understanding. "He's back." From the ridge, another shot rang out. Eliza, seeing Jacob's intervention, had renewed her own attack. A bullet kicked up the dirt at Silas's feet, forcing him to scramble for better cover. The fight had turned. The hunters were now the hunted, trapped between two skilled marksmen. The third man, seeing his partner wounded and their leader in a panic, made a run for the horses. Jacob let him go. He was not the prize. Silas, consumed by a furious desperation, fired blindly first towards the ridge, then towards Jacob's position. But he was exposed, his tactical advantage gone. He knew it was over. "This ain't done, Galloway," he screamed, his voice raw with hatred, directed not at Jacob, but at the unseen woman on the ridge. He fired one last, wild shot before turning and sprinting for his own horse, leaving his wounded companion behind. Jacob let him go, too. He had what he needed. He watched Silas gallop out of the valley, a defeated man swallowed by the vastness of the plains. The silence that fell in the aftermath was profound. Jacob stepped out from his cover, his rifle held loosely at his side. The wounded bounty hunter was moaning on the ground, his fight gone. Jacob's eyes went to the ridge. "Eliza," he called out, his voice rough with emotion. "It's over. You can come down." He waited, his heart pounding, until he saw her figure emerge from the rocks. She moved slowly at first, then broke into a run, scrambling down the steep incline. He met her at the bottom. She threw herself into his arms, dropping the heavy rifle, and he held her tight, his face buried in her hair. She was shaking, the adrenaline finally leaving her, but she was safe. She was whole. He held her at arm's length, his hands on her shoulders, and looked at her. Her face was smudged with dirt and gunpowder. Her hair was a mess, and her new blue dress was torn. He had never seen anything more beautiful in his entire life. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name or hide. "You came back," she whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face, washing clean paths through the grime. "I'll always come back for you," he said, and in that moment, standing in the heart of the valley he had fought for, holding the woman he had fought for, he knew it was the truest thing he had ever said. The arrival of Sheriff Miller later that day was an almost comical anticlimax. Jacob, having retrieved the trussed and terrified Thomas Galloway, sent a message with the bounty hunter he'd allowed to flee, telling him to fetch the law if he wanted to see his partner again. Miller arrived with a posse of 3 nervous-looking deputies. Finding a scene of strange domesticity, Jacob was tending to the wounded bounty hunter's shoulder, Eliza was calmly making a pot of coffee, and Thomas Galloway was tied to a chair by the hearth, weeping softly. The story, when it was finally untangled, was a messy, sordid affair of betrayal and greed. Thomas, under the stern gaze of both the sheriff and Jacob, confessed everything. He recounted the plan hatched by Silas Black, the bungled robbery, Silas's cold-blooded murder of the guard, and the cynical plot to frame Eliza, leaving her to the mercy of the law while they escaped. The wounded bounty hunter, eager to curry favor, confirmed that Silas had hired them, not for the official bounty, but with the specific instruction to ensure Eliza Galloway was never brought back alive. It was a contract for murder, disguised as justice. Sheriff Miller, a man accustomed to lost cattle and drunken brawls, looked overwhelmed. He scratched his head, staring from the confession of Thomas to the official wanted poster in his hand. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "This is one for the books." He took Thomas and the injured bounty hunter into custody. Before he left, he turned to Jacob. "That $10,000 reward, technically, with Galloway captured on your land, it's yours." Jacob looked at Eliza, who stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. He thought of the leaking barn roof, the bull he needed, the 100 small things that money could fix. Then he looked at her face, at the freedom and hope that were finally dawning there, and he knew the money was a curse he wanted no part of. "The only reward I'm interested in, Sheriff," Jacob said, his voice clear and steady, "is the official retraction of that poster. I want Eliza Galloway's name cleared, publicly." Miller nodded, a newfound respect in his eyes. "Consider it done, Jacob. And I reckon the stage line will want to offer you both something for bringing this to a close." "We'll see," Jacob said, his gaze returning to Eliza. That was a bridge they would cross later. With the departure of the sheriff and his prisoners, a profound quiet settled over the ranch. It was a different kind of quiet than before. It was not the silence of solitude or the tense silence of fear. It was the silence of peace, of homecoming. They stood on the porch, watching the dust from the posse's horses settle in the evening light. The day's violence seemed a world away, a bad dream dispelled by the warm glow of the setting sun. "It's over," Eliza said softly, as if still trying to believe it. "It's finally over." "Yes," Jacob agreed. He turned to her, the stoic mask he wore for the world falling away, revealing the deep, raw emotion beneath. "What will you do now?" It was the question that hung between them. The final, unanswered piece of their story. Her name was clear. She was free to go anywhere she wanted. to Ohio, to California, to a new life far away from the dust and hardship of this territory. She looked out at the valley, at the creeks shimmering in the last light, at the sturdy stone house that had been her sanctuary. It was no longer a prison, but a home. She looked at the man beside her, the quiet, solitary rancher who had charged into her life and fought for her as if she were his own. "I don't have any plans," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She turned her gaze to him, her heart in her eyes. I was thinking I might be home." Jacob's breath hitched. He had spent years building walls around his heart, protecting himself from the pain of loss. Eliza had not just breached those walls, she had dismantled them, stone by stone, with her courage, her resilience, and the quiet strength of her spirit. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. Her hand, which had once felt so fragile, now felt strong and sure. "I'd like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd like that very much." He had found a woman in his creek, a fugitive with a price on her head. He had recognized her face from a wanted poster and, in doing so, had been forced to confront the man he was and the man he wanted to be. He had chosen not the gold, but the woman. And in that choice he had found a treasure far greater than $10,000. He had found a reason to let the world back in. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of life on the Blackwater Ranch found a new, harmonious cadence. The lingering shadows of Silas Black and the bounty hunters faded with the morning mist, replaced by the simple, grounding routines of work and shared living. The news from Redemption confirmed that Eliza's name was officially cleared. The story of her ordeal and Jacob's role in uncovering the truth had become something of a local legend. Thomas Galloway, in exchange for his full testimony against Silas Black, received a reduced sentence for his role in the robbery. A federal marshal was now hunting Silas, who had vanished into the lawless territories, a fugitive himself. The stage line, true to the sheriff's word, sent a representative to the ranch. He was a portly man in a city suit, who looked distinctly out of place against the rugged backdrop of the valley. He offered them a substantial reward, a gesture of gratitude from the company. Jacob and Eliza discussed it that evening, sitting by the hearth. The firelight danced across their faces, casting a warm, intimate glow. "We should take it," Eliza said, her tone practical. "Your barn roof isn't going to fix itself, and you've been talking about needing a new bull since the day I met you." Jacob looked at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was a sight that still made her heart skip a beat. "You've been listening." "I always listen," she said softly. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. "We need a new bull," he corrected her gently, "and our barn roof needs fixing." The shared pronoun hung in the air, a quiet and profound declaration. This was no longer just his ranch, it was theirs. The reward money wasn't a prize for a past deed, but an investment in a shared future. They worked together, falling into a natural partnership. Jacob taught her more about the land, about the cattle, about the delicate balance of life in the valley. She was a quick learner, her intelligence and resilience shining through in everything she did. She was no longer afraid of the vast open spaces. She saw the beauty and the freedom in them, the same things he had always cherished. In turn, she brought a new life to the stone house. She planted a small garden, its tender green shoots a vibrant promise against the dark earth. She filled the quiet rooms with the scent of baking bread and the sound of her soft humming. She coaxed stories from him, tales of his youth and his dreams, gently unlocking the doors to the lonely rooms of his heart. He discovered she had a quick, dry wit that made him laugh, a sound that had become rare in his years of solitude. She discovered he had a tender, patient side that he reserved for injured animals and for her. One afternoon he found her down by the creek, at the exact spot where he had first found her. She was not looking at the water with fear, but with a serene contemplation. He came and stood beside her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I was thinking about how much can change," she said, looking up at him. "When I was in this water, I thought my life was over. I thought I was drowning." "You were," he said, his voice quiet. "And you pulled me out," she finished. "In more ways than one, Jacob. You pulled me out of the darkness." He didn't have the words to express the depth of his feelings, the overwhelming sense of rightness he felt when he was with her, so he simply reached for her, his arms wrapping around her waist, and drew her close. She leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. The sun was warm on their backs, and the only sounds were the rush of the creek and the whisper of the wind through the cottonwoods. It was a perfect, peaceful moment, a testament to the life they were building together, a life forged in violence and fear, but now tempered into something strong and beautiful. It was a second chance for both of them, a new beginning, found in the most unlikely of places, born from a desperate flight and a fateful discovery in the cold, rushing waters of a lonely creek. The first snow of the season came early that year, a fine white powder that dusted the peaks of the surrounding mountains and laid a sparkling blanket across the valley floor. The world outside the ranch house grew quiet, hushed under the weight of the coming winter. Inside, however, the house was filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the roaring fire in the hearth. The barn roof was repaired, sturdy and new, and a magnificent Hereford bull, purchased with the last of the reward money, ruled over the small herd. The ranch was secure, fortified not just with new timber and livestock, but with a shared sense of purpose. Jacob and Eliza had settled into a life that was both wonderfully ordinary and quietly extraordinary. The specter of the wanted poster, the terror of the chase, had receded into a distant memory, a harrowing prologue to the real story of their lives. One cold December evening, as a blizzard raged outside, Jacob sat at the table, meticulously oiling his rifle, a ritual of maintenance and care. Eliza sat across from him, a book open in her lap, though she was watching him more than she was reading. The light from the lantern cast a golden glow on his weathered face, highlighting the lines of concentration around his eyes. He looked up and caught her gaze. "What is it?" he asked, his hand stilling. "I was just thinking," she said, a soft smile on her lips. "The day you found that wanted poster, what did you really think?" He put down his oilcloth and leaned back in his chair, considering the question. He had never truly spoken of the turmoil of that moment, the stark choice that had confronted him. "I thought," he began slowly, his voice a low rumble, "that $10,000 was a fortune. I thought of all the things it could fix. I thought that trusting people was a fool's game, a lesson I had learned a long time ago." He looked at her, his eyes clear and direct. "But then I thought of you. I remembered pulling you from the water, how you felt like you weighed nothing at all. I remembered the fear in your eyes. And I knew that if I turned you in, if I took that money, I'd have to look at my own face in the mirror every day for the rest of my life. And I wouldn't like the man I saw." He paused, the only sound in the room the howling of the wind outside. "Choosing to help you, it wasn't about being a hero, Eliza. It was about being a man I could live with. You gave me that. You reminded me of a part of myself I thought I had lost for good." Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming love. She closed her book and went to him, kneeling beside his chair and taking his large, calloused hand in both of her own. "You saved my life, Jacob," she whispered. "You saved mine right back," he answered, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. He stood, pulling her to her feet. He framed her face with his hands, his gaze searching hers. All the unspoken words, all the shared fears and quiet moments of joy passed between them in that look. He had found more than a woman in his creek. He had found his courage. He had found his heart. He had found his home. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that was not born of frantic passion or desperate relief, but of a deep, abiding love and a promise of all the quiet, ordinary, wonderful years to come. Outside, the storm could rage, but inside the stone walls of the house and inside the sturdy walls of the life they had built together, they were safe, they were home, and they were finally, irrevocably, at peace.